Hi, Helene. Welcome to Scarsdale Library and
Oh, thank you.
to our book club.
Thank you
Uh,
for having me. Thank you for reading my book.
oh, it's so great.
It was wonderful.
Oh, thank you.
I know this was my second reading. I read it back when it first came out, and when I, when your second one came out, I was like, oh, I'm gonna have to reread now because why not make everybody else do it with me? So,
And it took a long time between books, so
yeah.
reread is probably a good idea.
Well, you have so much detail in these books, and there are so many characters, and they all have their place in the story. So yeah, it's a reread, but which is fine, which is great, and I enjoyed it just as much the second time.
Oh, thank you. That's good to hear.
Um, we have so many questions for you. But where did this story come from? Where did these characters come from? How are they so alive?
Um, so it's a good question. First, I have to say I apologize if I start sweating. It's 107 here
Oh my God.
in the East Bay area, and our air conditioning is not keeping up very well. So if it's not stress if I start, getting a sheen about me. It's just a little schwitzy here.
That's
Um,
terrible.
yeah, it's a bit much, and I hope today's supposed to be the worst of it. But the rest of the work week doesn't look that much better. But so where did this all come from? Um, so what happened? I sort of have to go back a ways, which is that when I was in my early to mid 20s, I'd been working as a uh, marketing and public relations assistant, associate, for a number of years. I think like 7 years all told by the time that I left the job. And uh, decided that I needed to be a writer. It was like the thing that I had always wanted to do, but I was like, no, I need a career. I need like to actually go out in the world and, get a job that's got a 401k and happy hours and things like that. So I did that and was miserable for a good long time after college, until finally, through like the prodding of loved ones and my own sort of reckoning, was like, okay, no, I really do have to do this. Um, I decided to go back to school, and get my master's of fine arts in creative writing. And I was very, very lucky to get let into Columbia in New York. And so when you get there, the first thing they do is they say, okay, you're going to come out of this program with a thesis. You need to have a thesis, and that's going to be like your body of creative writing that's it's like a collection of short stories or part of a novel, and that's going to be your sort of what you need to graduate, but also sort of your entree into the publishing world. This is going to be like what you send out, part of what you send out when you start looking to get published. And so I was like, okay, I'm an adult now. I'm writing adult things, and I need to, you know, and there's something about being in an MFA program that's very intimidating and makes you feel like you have to be Raymond Carver. So, um, so I was like, okay, I'm going to write quiet, emotional, real life stories about my family and my husband's family. And I'm Jewish and he's Arab American. And we'd always, um, we known each other since like God, I met him like my first 3 weeks of college, basically. And so we grew up like 45 minutes away from each other in the Chicago suburbs, and so we had all of these similarities, and part of the similarities was this family history of immigration to the US and what that means to be just slightly outside the dominant culture. And so I was like, and there were all these like weird parallels between our families. And so I was like, I'm going to write about that. So I started writing these very realistic short stories. And I got maybe like 4 or 5 of them under my belt. And but the problem that I started running into was that they weren't very good. They just weren't good stories yet. Um, and I think part of that was I just wasn't a very good writer yet. But another pretty big part of it was that these are stories I'd heard for years, either in my own family or his. And I wasn't discovering them fresh for myself. I was telling something I already knew, and it had that feeling of something that's been told a million times. So I was like, I need to find another, I need to figure out how to do better than this. I need to find another way into this. And I was complaining about it to a friend of mine in the program who was in my workshop classes. And she said, Helene, you're going, basically, she, in as many words almost, said, you're going about this all wrong. She said, I know you. I've been to your apartment. I've seen your bookshelves. I know what a total nerd you are. I know that you love sci fi and fantasy. You're always talking in class about the use of the fantastical and literary fiction. Why aren't you doing that? Because that's where your heart is. And I just sort of, it just set me back on my heels. And I was like, oh, that's interesting. Okay. But how would I do that and this? And she said, well, you figure it out. But the next thing I see from you in workshop, it can be about your families, but I want it to be fantastical.
Mm.
And I was like, okay. So, and it was like, she literally just gave me an order. And I went back to my apartment and I sat down and I was like, okay, so if we're allowed to play with this, if I can like, uncouple it from real life, what if instead of like the Jewish girl and the Arab American boy who'd been threading through these stories together, what if we Neil Gaiman this up? What if we make it into like the most emblematic folkloric creature of each culture? What if we make it a girl golem and a boy genie? And I could pretty much immediately see them, like just sort of in my mind's eye. There was like this tall woman who looked very unsure of herself and a little prim and proper, and this equally tall man who looked a little more sort of cocky and suave and like a bit of a bad boy. I was like, okay, you two are interesting. What am I going to do with you? And literally over like the next 4 hours, I came up with a rudimentary version of the setup that would eventually become the Golem and the Genie. That it was, okay, this is gonna be like an Ellis Island story because it still had like that folklore feel and like an older time feel than modern day. I was like, okay, so it'll be like around the turn of the 20th century. It'll be in New York because with like the little that I knew at the time, was that, you know, the Jewish immigration had sort of peaked around the turn of the 20th century. And I knew that there had been some Arab immigration at that time too, but I didn't know like who it was or from when or whatever. I was just like, everyone was coming through Ellis Island at that time. If these two are going to meet anywhere, it's going to be in New York around 1900. Okay. And I just started to write what I thought was a short story. And by the end of that day, I banged out like the first 12 pages of what became The Golem and the Genie. And I took it to workshop and I handed it out and I said, okay, so here's what I've got, this new short story that I'm working on, and let me know what you think. And they read it and they got back to me and they said, well, this is more interesting than anything you've given us so far, so thank you. But you're wrong about something. This isn't a short story. This is a novel. And they were like unanimous on this. They were like, this is a novel. It's going to take you a while, so you better get going. And I did not believe them. I did not want to believe them for a long time. But I was like, I'm just going to finish this and then going to get back to what I was doing. So I kept writing and writing and writing. And it was like I was chasing the horizon. Like it just sort of kept running from me. And eventually I was like, oh, dang it, they're right. Okay. So at that point, I just sort of put everything else like aside permanently, as it turned out, and went to the library and just sat down and started to research. And because I knew nothing, like I had to find out basically from scratch everything about life in turn of the 20th century New York. So that took a long time. And thankfully, I was in New York and I was at Columbia and the libraries there. This is like,
Oh, they're incredible.
yeah, 2005, 6. So, I mean, these days, it's amazing what you can write about like old New York from a sofa in like, California. That everything is digitized. But back then, I mean, it's not like we still need libraries. Let's let's make that clear. But it was such a benefit to be there, like walking through these stacks where you could tell that, like, okay, am I the first person that's walked down this aisle in what, weeks, months, just because you're in like 6 floors down in the in the main library looking for like the notes from some like neighborhood meeting in 1892 that's going to give you like the names of the people who lived in a particular street or whatever. And so there was a lot of research, and there was a lot of letting the characters sort of grow from being like these sort of supernatural stand-ins for me and my husband to who they were in themselves, like with their own concerns and their own histories, and then having them and building them so that when they met, they would spark off each other and become like these sort of opposites who are bound together by this larger experience. And that's, I mean, it was a lot of like slow incremental building and then taking down again and then building more up, and eventually that's just how it came to be.
How long did it take you?
7 years
Wow.
from that first workshop to yeah, from the first workshop to getting published. It came out
Wow.
in 2013, and it was like, yeah, 2006 when, yeah, so 7 years.
Wow.
Long time.
Yeah.
Did any of the original family stories remain in the book?
Um, no, not really, because our family history of immigration started a lot later.
Okay.
My family came over, my family, the earliest anyone came over was, it was all World War II centered, either right before or after. And Kareem's family, like his father came over in the 70s after Kareem was born. So that was a much later sort of saga.
Very different stories
Yeah,
then.
yeah.
Yeah. Hello. Hi.
Hello.
I'm curious, how do you maintain um, the interest, the drive, the appetite to keep this up for 7 years? Was there any point that you just couldn't bear writing about them anymore, or did it just get better for you?
Oh no. Um, there were multiple points when I really, really wanted to, not just like emotional, but common sense was like, okay, put it in a drawer now. Like you've spent too long on this, and it's not, the payoff hasn't happened yet, and I'm a very cautious person by nature, and this is probably the most outrageous thing I've ever done with my life, was work for that long on something that was not getting me anywhere immediately.
Mm.
Um, and there were a number of points where it just seemed like the whole thing was falling apart. The book, like plot wise, or I, would give chapters to friends and they'd read it and they'd go, no, this isn't, no, this isn't working now. And at one point, I think I'd been working on it for 4 years, and I had to go back to the beginning and start over, because I'd really screwed up Kava's character, and she needed a complete redo.
Mm.
And that was when I added her empathy, that she has the power to sort of feel other people. She hadn't had that until then. And what I was getting from all of my readers, my early readers, was she is too emotionless and too confused about other people. She is not, um, basically, she's boring and sort of irritating because we understand what she doesn't, and that makes us impatient, which is a very easy trap to fall into. And I fell into it. And then I had to figure out, okay, how do I keep her alien, but get her to understand people better enough that she can have more effective conversations, that she can be a more effective main character. Um, and so she gained a little more humanity and lost a little sort of androidness, robotness, uh,
Mhm.
in the rewrite. But what it meant was that I had to go back to each scene and be like, okay, who's she in a room with? What are they thinking? What is she getting from that? And how do I, sort of incorporate that? And everything had to sort of change and fall out from there.
Wow.
So,
But it
yeah.
made her a lot of fun.
I thought so too. I thought so too. I was a very a very good change for her character, and it made it a lot easier to root for her as like someone who's trying to find their way. Um, but it was a lot of work, and at that time I was thankfully didn't have kids, no mortgage. I'm just sort of working a bunch of weird, odd jobs to, pay the bills and to student loans, and so managed to just sort of pull it all together. And by the time I yeah, and then when did I'm trying to remember how the whole thing lined up with at some point, like I had an agent, or I didn't have I wasn't like um uh under contract to an agent, but there was an agent in New York who I'd been sort of sending pages to now and again as part of all of this, who I'd met when I was at Columbia, and eventually he decided to take me on as a client. And the book was only half written at that point. I had an outline for the rest of it. But then once that happened, and he sold it to HarperCollins, I was able to drop the all of my weird odd jobs and just write for the next year.
Mm.
So yeah.
That's great.
Thank you.
We talked a bit about Hava's ability to hear other people's thoughts and just her effort at trying to sort of access humanity. Whether it's like keeping herself busy, trying to remember to breathe, avoiding perfection, all of that. Do you think her ability to hear people's thoughts gave her better or worse understanding of humanity? Because I feel like that could go either way.
Oh, totally. And I think I think in the end it gave her a better understanding of humanity, but was probably more confusing for her, in that it was like you have to sort of piece out the threads of there's something that the rabbi tells her at one point, that you're going to have to learn to judge people by their actions and not their thoughts. And that, I think, what would be the hardest, for me. Lord knows I don't want anyone else in my head all day long listening to all the horrible things that I think. But, hopefully you don't see them in my, day-to-day actions, because I choose to, act hopefully upon, the best of my thoughts that I can. And I think, and so I don't envy her. And I probably, if someone in actuality was walking around listening to everyone's thoughts, that poor person, like I toned it down for the book. I can't imagine how much crap she'd have to listen to all day long.
People can be terrible for
It
sure.
can be terrible.
Yeah. and sort of a similar question was the thing that came up as sort of the softening element for Ahmad was Matthew, which was a real surprise.
Mm-hmm.
How did you pull off that ending?
How did I pull off the ending with Matthew?
Well, with all of it, with I
Oh.
mean, with
How did you weave that whole story that went back
Oh.
in time and back in I mean, that was amazing.
It took a long time. This is why it took 7 years.
I can imagine. That was
Time.
it's just amazing.
Well, thank you. There were parts of it that I'd had in mind from the beginning. Or if not the beginning, at least relatively close to the beginning. Sort of one of the big revelations about how one person is actually the same person from long ago, is that was something that I'd figured out like a couple years into the writing, when I realized I had physically described two characters exactly the same way. And I was like, well, that's great. Now they just look like they're the same person. And then I went, oh wait, oh my God, what if they were the same person? And that sort of, it made sense thematically. And I was like, okay, that's how we tie everything back in. And so I still remember I was living in Oakland at the time, and we had this tiny apartment with these and two cats, and I was just walking around the apartment like doing this, like trying to figure out how it was all going to play out in my mind, and the cats were sort of following me and jumping out from like oh my God, she's gone crazy, just sort of getting out of my way. And so but then it was like, years before I actually wrote that ending. I had to get there, and so I had to figure out what, just logistically what that meant. And I did timelines, I did charts, I did outlines, I did hand drawn like boxes and arrows and things, and every single one of them got ripped up in the end. But it was like, I have to have a plan so I can move forward. The plan is going to change, but without the plan, I can't write at all. So it's a lot of feeling like I need. I've heard writers. I can't remember which writer it was. It was one of, it was probably like Saul Bellow or someone said it's like driving at night, that you have to have a plan. The plan is like the headlights. You can only see as far as the headlights, but you can drive across the whole country that way, so long as you know where it is that you're going. So just having enough of a plan to move forward. But then I had so many moving pieces that it would screw up, and I'd have to back up and try again. Actually, it was worse with the second book, because I was with Hidden Palace. I don't know, you guys haven't read it yet.
I have.
Oh, you have. There are it takes place over a much longer time span. It's 15 years from beginning to end, and there are a number of historical events that get threaded into the plot. So I had to write. It's like I can't move those, right? It's like if something's happening a couple of years too early for the characters, that I can't fix that. That's like, I have to change the characters. I can't change when the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire happened. I got to make some other change. So It's like trying to write around boulders that I have to then incorporate and move other things around that I can move. So yeah. I am no good at like making things easy for myself.
Somebody here asked about the iron cuff on him, on the Jinni,
Mm-hmm.
right? Somebody here
Was it ever removable by anybody?
Yeah.
Yeah. What is it? Sorry,
Was it ever removable by anybody?
So far.
Okay. That's what I know. I was like, I'll ask, but I don't.
Not so far. That I know of yet.
So just going back to what you were saying, I always love talking to authors because every single one of you talk about that whole process totally differently.
Mm-hmm.
So, whether it's creating a map and then throwing it away as you go. I talked to some authors like, oh yeah, I start at the beginning and I write to the end. And then I start at the beginning again. And I was like, that sounds kind of crazy to me, but all right, whatever
I have
works.
friends who do that, and I don't know how they do it. Like, I just write the whole book, and then I look at it, and I take what I want, and then I'm like, okay, I like this part and this part and this part, and then start at the beginning again, and I write the whole book again, and I'm like, no, don't do that. I can't do it. I don't know how you would do that. But other people look at me and they're like, okay, you're insane, and why are you doing that to yourself? And I'm like, I can't, I don't know.
It's so funny because everybody says something different. It's
Yep.
interesting, always interesting to hear. Did you know much about the stories of golems and genies going into the writing of this?
Not a lot. I knew of golems. I mean, I knew the basic outline of the original story of the Golem of Prague. And I knew modern retellings of that story. But it wasn't like I did any real research or, focus on those until I started writing this. For Jin, I knew even less. It was like, I knew, what do you know growing up in America is, if this isn't,
Aladdin.
yeah, exactly. It's Aladdin and maybe a few of the original tales from the Thousand and One Nights. I Dream of Genie, I saw that on Nickelodeon reruns when I was a kid. And
Did your husband help you?
no, because he knew a little more than I did. He'd read some more than I did, but he hadn't really delved into it either. So what I did was I just went, again to the library and just started reading and researching. And what I came up with for Jin was that, I mean, golems, it's like, okay, there's a basic story, and I felt like I could pretty much do with it what I wanted to, because it's my culture, and I could, as long as it is recognizably like a golem that, is created by a rabbi and has a propensity for violence. At that point, I mean, there's only a few things that like structurally are necessary for the golem story. Um, Jin was much more intimidating because there are so many different versions told among so many different cultures, from earliest recorded, you know uh writing in the Middle East up until now. I mean, they are still very much a part of um Muslim and Arab cosmology, that they're included in the Quran. The Quran is the word of God, therefore jinn exist. And to this day you can like get, people leave out offerings, or there's exorcisms, and there's all, I mean, it's all still there. So that was more intimidating. I was like, okay, I want to be respectful, um but it also seems like there's a billion different stories and they all contradict each other, so what the hell do I do? And in the end it was just like, okay, I had to sort of decide on, you know, I had authorial license at some point to create my version of Jin, as long as it was respectful and like recognizably a classical configuration of Jin. It didn't have to be all of them, but it had to be recognizable to someone in the culture. And I eventually that was what I settled on.
Well,
When
he's
the book was done, did you personally identify with any of the characters that you had created?
Oh yeah, I mean, I identify with Chava in that, like, I'm nervous
Read
as
people's
hell.
minds. No.
Sorry.
I said, yeah, you read people's minds. No.
No, I don't read people's minds, but I gave her my anxiety, and and that, she very much wants to, there's a lot of wanting to fit in, but always feeling weird that sort of happens. And, especially growing up as a nerd in the suburbs, in the 80s. And I identify with her a lot. Who else did I identify with in that book? My favorite, and I didn't identify with, but my favorite character to write was Ice Cream Saleh.
I wanted to ask you about
Yeah, we
him.
all liked him.
Yeah, good. He's one of my favorite. He really is one of my favorites, and he was my favorite to write because I always knew what he was going to say. Everyone else, it was like pulling teeth. It was all these big philosophical arguments, and I had to sort of, tinker with the conversation to get them where I needed them to go. Sala, it was like, this is what he's going to say, and he's going to be pissed off. He's just going to be like, oh, why do I have to deal with these like crazy creatures? And I just always knew, and he was just such a sweetheart, and he's such a sort of a in to the characters in the book, he's sort of like a quiet peripheral presence, but he's got his own story, and his story is a relatively big one. So yeah, I always just really liked him. I wish I could be Mariam. I wish I could have that effect on people, and that sort of understanding of people. Um, the character I like the least, no one ever asks me this, but the character, and this is my own fault, the character um, I like the least is the nephew. Why am I blanking on his
Michael,
Michael? I keep thinking Daniel.
he's
That
your
was
character.
What
Yeah, I
character?
know, right?
What character?
He was named Daniel at one point, and I switched it, and for some reason, his name is always the one I blank on, and I think it's because I just don't like him. I've never felt like I did a good job by him. He's such a schlemiel. He's like a really nice guy, but he doesn't have a clue. And it's again that thing where you know more than a character does about what's going on. And so you can't help but feel like, for God's sake, you're lying next to a woman who's made of clay. Please clue in. Like, how do you not realize this? And who thinks to look for that in real life? But
Of
if
course.
you know, it's killing you that he doesn't. So yeah, so I feel like I did him dirty, but
Well, so one of the things that came up in our conversation before you joined us is Hava's decision to marry.
mhm,
It just seemed a little bit out of nowhere. Like, okay, I'm either going to kill myself
mhm,
or I'm gonna get married. And
yeah,
I'm like,
yeah, yeah.
okay.
You and me both. It wasn't. It's not. It was like, okay, if she couldn't do that, what it came down to for me was like her instinct is to
Oh.
find a master, is to have someone tell her what to do. And I probably did not bring this out enough, but what it struck me was what it I don't know, what I feel like part of it is playing with was like, okay, in 1899 culture, if you're a woman and you want someone to like tell you what to do, you find a man, and that's, it's like you find you know a man who is going to be the head of the household and will, at that point, like, your life is laid out for you, and that is what you're going to do. um and so it was some of that, but yeah, it's not, it could have taken a little more developing. It was sort of a lot happening quickly. So yeah, and
Well,
it's
I
always
mean,
like this moment of crisis, and yeah.
yeah, and it's just funny when you sort of lay that up against Sophia's story and how
Mhm.
her unwillingness to marry, or her lack of desire for marriage combined with a couple unusual circumstances, kind of allow her to sort of pursue her dreams a little bit better, and how she doesn't have to have that ruling man over her head,
Yeah.
kind of situation that, but it's funny looking at Hava making that decision, because I didn't really get the sense that she was walking around going, I need a master.
Yeah.
I got more of like, I need something to do. I need purpose. I need structure. I need to help.
Yep.
So,
But isn't that the nature of a golem, that they have to have a master to tell them what to do and give them instructions? Is that the whole thing behind the golem?
Yeah, and that is, and the question then is like, is she developed enough, and does she have enough of like a sense of personhood that she can sort of grow beyond that? So in that moment, sort of out of fear and in this moment of crisis, it's sort of like she's regressing. And that, yeah, I could have done it better.
but it wasn't a criticism. It was just
Oh no, I could have, like, seriously, I am probably like, I am a big critic of my own books. So like, there are parts when I'm reading, I'm like, oh Lord, come on.
Do you have a favorite little moment?
In that first book, a favorite moment. I love the first night that Chava and Ahmad are walking along the rooftops. And they have a conversation. They go up onto a water tower, and they're just looking out over the city, and they have a conversation. And it's the first conversation that they have that they know each other well enough to start really asking personal questions. And there's just a few really good moments in there. I think a number of like my favorite moments in the book are their conversations, and they were always so hard to write, because it was like, you can't advance things too quickly. You have to make the conversation flow naturally, at the same time give them enough to start learning each other and start liking each other. And it was just like every word felt charged, but by the time I was done with them, it was like, okay, that's a good moment. Like there's some good stuff in there. That's one of my favorites. The other favorite is when they go their first time walking in Central Park together, and they're discovering the park together. That's one of my, or he's showing her the park, and she's discovering it for the first time.
I would agree with you. I love those moments too. I also love that you made Ahmad an artist.
Oh, yeah. I don't know why exactly that happened. I think he needed a job, he needed something to do, and I knew that just, making a million pots and pans wasn't going to be enough for him. I knew that he got bored easily. And so I don't know how I got to the tin ceiling. People ask me, and I think part of it was just living in New York at the time and just getting interested and going, into old buildings and their lobbies and looking up, and there's the gorgeous pressed tin ceilings, and how they're always like the same patterns repeated. And at some point I was like, okay, well, what would you make in a tinsmith shop? And it was like, well, this and that and those. Okay, what about like those tin ceiling tiles? And I was like, well, you could do that, but what if he did, and that just sort of turned into, it was like a stray thought that turned into this giant thing.
I love it.
Yeah.
One of our members said she went down quite a rabbit hole looking for it.
Oh no! Oh no, I would love, that's the sort of thing where I'd love to see, like, what would that actually look like? What would that do to you, like standing under that and looking up at that and feeling like you're flying above it upside down? That would be interesting. I'd probably get really dizzy.
It'd be amazing
So
for
the
sure.
themes are so universal. Has anybody approached you about translating the book into other languages?
Well, it's been translated,
Oh.
I want to say, I think we're up to like 15 or 18 different languages at this point.
Oh my
Wow.
gosh, that's
Really
wonderful.
cool. Yeah.
That's
Um,
great.
and so, yeah, like, French, Spanish, Portuguese, German, Chinese,
Hopefully some Middle Eastern
no,
language.
Arabic, not a lot of books. There's not a huge Arabic translation market for books that aren't like insanely popular. Um, the people who read tend like the people, the literary crowd in the Middle East tends to have another language under their belt, so they either read in English or French.
Okay.
So, but that's also it's also political because there's presses don't get uh there's not a lot of American books that get translated that don't get scrutinized and
That's yeah.
blah blah blah.
Yeah.
The my book did get translated into Turkish, but that was back in 2000 like 14 or 15, and I'd be very interested to know if I'd be I wonder if they would have translated it these days if the
Right. Good point.
if the if it's riskier now to translate a book like that, but who knows. So
Well,
yeah,
congratulations.
thank
That's
you.
great. Yeah.
Thank you. The sequel, not so much. Sequels don't tend to get translated as much. Basically at this point it would have to be like if there's like a TV series ever made or something like that, then the translations start rolling in, which would be awesome, but not yet.
I have a question that I also love to ask. I listen to tons of books, and I listened to this, and you got George Goodall, and he's amazing.
Yes.
Did you have a say in that, or did he just drop into your lap, or?
He dropped into my lap, and I did not have a clue about what a gift that was because I wasn't at the time much of an audiobook reader. And it's still not like my preferred method, but I'm getting more into it. I sort of had to figure out what kind of books I liked on audio. But what happened was my editor called me up one day and said, "Helene, amazing news! We got George Guidall to do the audiobook." And I was like, "Great!
Yay, who's that?
And so I had to, and I did the research then, and figured out that, oh my God, this is huge. And then I had, I wasn't gonna listen to it because I was like, that's just weird, right? Like listening to your own book it's like, okay, it's the voices in your head actually like in your head. But so many people told me that he did such an amazing job, and I was just so curious. I was like, okay, I'm gonna listen. And after I'd heard him read the book, I could not picture anyone else's voice doing it. And when I was writing the second book, if I couldn't hear him say a sentence, it wasn't good enough. So
wow.
I like used his voice like in my head as a guide. Like I would slow down and say, okay, I would just like imagine him saying it. And if it didn't sound right, if he was like getting tripped up or if it just didn't sound right, I went back and fixed the sentence. And then once I turned the book in, I begged my editor. I was like, can we please get him again? I will fly out and, fall on my knees in front of him. I will send him gift baskets galore. Whatever he wants, but he agreed and he did it. And I was just thrilled.
Well, he did an incredible job, as he always does.
Yes.
And I did listen to this the first time around years ago too, and I remember, oh my God, the audio is so good. I have to go back at that and listen again. So of course, as soon as I was done, I started the second one.
Cool.
Like immediately. So congrats on that.
Thank you.
I'm gonna have to start wrapping up soon,
Mhm.
but I would love to ask you if you were able or willing to talk. Are you working on anything now?
I am working on book number 3. It's still in outline form. It's very it's still very pliable in my brain, and I'm not sure that everything, of the entire plot right now. But it's there, and it's set in 1930. So first one 1899 to 1900, second one 1900 to 1915, and now we have jumped forward in time 15 years to 1930.
Oh, now I'm so curious.
So, it's the end of Prohibition, the beginning of the Great Depression, sort of the heyday of organized crime, and a lot of just a lot of good meat to sort of chew around with and play with, and uh, you know, um, some characters who were in the first book but not the second have come back in the third. There's a few that are, completely new characters. What's fun is and talking to other authors who've written series say the same thing, is the characters who are sort of like the side characters in previous books always end up like becoming main characters in the later books, because you just get too curious about them. And
That's so great.
it's like I want to learn more about that guy. Who is that guy? And what's his future? And so they, people sort of thread in and out, and yeah, it's coming along.
Are you enjoying the process, or is it a plod? Is it
It's
like a tough thing?
it always goes more slowly than I would like. Especially like, so these days, my life looks a lot different than when was sort of starting to write or in the middle of writing the first book. I've got 2 elementary school age kids,
Oh boy.
and I've got a dog, and it's my day is a lot more structured. I can't just sit on the sofa and write 24, like it used to be, like literally my husband would leave for work in the morning, and sorry, there's
Oh
stop.
boy.
Sorry, no, it's the extreme heat.
Why isn't your fan on, your ceiling fan?
Because it would be, then it's just like this spinning weird thing in the background, and I didn't want to do that. I'm okay. It's just there's telling everyone to please turn off your ovens and microwaves and whatever.
Because
Okay,
clearly you want to have the oven on it when it's 107 degrees out.
right? Yeah. So I think, tonight is taco tray from Costco. That's what dinner is. So sorry, what was the question before the county interrupted
the
us?
process of like how it feels to be
right
in the middle of it, and how busy you are now.
Yeah, and so it's like I only have a certain number of hours of the day in which to really sort of get into it. And it can be sort of hard it feels like I'm living 2 different lives, sometimes, like, and there's like this very schizophrenic moment switching between them, where it's like, okay, I have to stop worrying about the kids and the laundry and dinner and the dog and all of that, and I have to start working on these people who don't exist and figuring them out. And then at some point I have to start worrying about the actual people again. And so it really is this, I don't think I'm ever going to get used to it, that feeling of like, okay, I have to stop being in the real world and now for my job go into my head and come up with some imaginary things. Like it's just a really wacky way to make a living when
That's a really fun way of putting it, though.
it is, but it's also like, and this pays the bills, which is just not like, because then that's like a pressure in itself. It's like, well, what if the imaginary people are wrong? What if I can't do it today? There's a lot of like, if you're doing something for a living where it's like, at the end of the day, you can look and say, look, I dug that ditch. That was not done earlier today, and now it is. And if what I have at the end of the day is, well, I think I figured out a character's motivation, it's like that, it doesn't, it's a lot of incremental weird progress that you're never really sure is actually progress until you get enough of it that you're like, okay, this is a thing here now that I can start working with. It's just very strange.
It's great. Well, I'm gonna have to kind of end things, but I mean, I feel like we could talk easily for a lot longer. Helene, thank you so much. It's been such a treat to talk to you, and good luck on the writing and the playing with the people in your head when when everybody else is busy. And I can't wait for the next one.
Well, thank you.
You know,
and thank you for reading, and for Katie for putting this together, and it was wonderful talking to all of you, and yeah, have a good night.